Good morning, scholars. Welcome to my kids' classroom. This is where we do school with our kids, so I felt it would be appropriate. We're going to try this, and we're going to see if it works. Hopefully, it will. We'll be able to accomplish what we need to use this method. You should be continuing to read your textbooks. You should be continuing to take your quizzes and prepare for the next exam. What we're going to talk about today, I'm trying to limit these to 25-30 minutes a piece. We're going to try to get through the idea of the Electoral College, and then I'll give you an overview of the first 6 presidencies. Okay, the first 6 presidencies. A lot of confusion about the Electoral College. The Electoral College today is kind of different than the way it was when the Constitution was first written. The way the Electoral College functioned in that day was that the Electoral College doesn't necessarily vote for a person. They vote for the 2 people that they believed were most capable of doing the job of president. So each elector would actually vote for 2 people. Okay, now, little review, the way that we establish electors for each state is that it's based on the number of individuals in the Congress, the number of congressional districts you have, plus their 2 senators. So for example, today, Tennessee has 11 electoral votes. We have 9 congressional districts, plus our 2 senators gives us 11 electoral votes in the state of Tennessee. So what we've got here is we've got 4 individuals. You have to remember, in the early part of the Republic, we didn't have officially political parties. Very quickly we found 2 governing philosophies, the Federalists and the Republic, as you've been reading about. These 2 groups of men sort of catalyzed towards each other and created what we would call political parties, what they would have called political faction. Okay? So what you'd have is 4 individuals who are nominated to be considered for president and vice president. Okay? We're just going to use Tom, Dick, Harry, and John. Tom, Dick, Harry, and John. Okay? Now, over here are our list of electors. Our list of electors. These electors aren't voting for the person who's going to be president. They're voting for the 2 individuals that they believe would make good presidents. They're voting for the 2 individuals they believe would make a good president. So, what they would do is you would have a vote for John and Dick, and then Tom and Harry, and then Harry and Dick, and then Dick and John, and then Harry and John, and then Tom and Harry. All right, you see how that works? And it would be John and Dick. They're in no particular order as to which one serves in what capacity. And then you'd have John and Harry. And then you'd have Tom and Dick. And then you'd have Dick and Harry. And then you'd have John and Tom. And then you've had John and Harry. And Dick and Harry. And we'd have Tom and Harry. And we'd have Dick and John. And we'd have Tom and John. And Dick and John. Now these would be the individuals. These would be the individuals. Now I'm going to ask one of my sons to read off the candidates. He's over here playing on, what is that? Minecraft. Is that Minecraft? Okay, I'm going to put a tick mark, and so you're going to read down the list and tell me who. Just tell me the 2 first letters.
JD.
JD.
TH.
TH.
HD.
HD.
DJ.
DJ.
HJ.
HJ.
TH.
TH.
JD.
JD.
JH.
JH.
TD.
TD.
DH.
DH.
JT.
JT.
JH.
JH.
DH.
DH.
TH.
T H
DJ.
D J
TJ.
T J
DJ.
D J.
That's it.
Is that it?
Yeah.
So there's our election. That's our election. That's how it boiled down. What's required under the Constitution is that since we have 17, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15, 16, 17, we got 17 electors. What we need is for one of these individuals to have a clear majority of the 17 electors, which would be, what, 8, 7.5? And so the winner would be John. John would be the winner. The vice president is selected by whoever has the second number. In this case, we've got a tie between Harry and Dick. But we can change that. We can change that one to a J, and then, poor Dick gets left out, and John gets an additional vote. Okay, so the person with the clear majority of the Electoral College becomes the president. Okay, and then the person who has the second number of electoral votes, the second most, becomes the vice president, which, since we covered that one, would be Harry. So John would be the president and Harry would be the vice president. Now, the Electoral College was designed so that the smaller states and the larger states would have equal opportunity in selecting who the leader of the country would be. Now, it's not completely devoid of influence based on population, which we'll see here coming up in this next section. We talk about the first 6 presidents. Because the electors are established by the number of congressional districts plus the 2 senators. Okay? The congressional districts are established based on population. Now, we'll go ahead and erase these guys since our election is over. And we'll talk about our first 6 presidents. The first 6 presidents. Well, we've got George Washington. We've got John Adams. And we've got Thomas Jefferson. And then from Jefferson, we've got James Madison. Then we've got James Monroe. And then we've got John Quincy Adams, JQA, who is John Adams' son. There's a couple interesting things that I want to bring to light about these guys. Politically, they would be identified by us, not by themselves. They didn't believe in political parties. But George Washington and John Adams would have self-identified as Federalists. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe would have identified as Republicans. John Quincy Adams would have been the remnants of the Federalist Party. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party, the group who calls themselves Federalists, lose most of their political clout. Couple other interesting things about these guys as far as their terms in office, their tenure in office. George Washington serves for 8 years. John Adams serves for 4 years. Thomas Jefferson serves for 8 years. Madison serves for 8 years. Monroe serves for 8 years. And John Quincy Adams serves for 4 years. Okay? For me, one of the more interesting aspects of this breakdown of these presidents is where they're from. George Washington is from Virginia. John Adams is from New England. Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia. James Madison is from Virginia. James Monroe from Virginia. John Quincy Adams from New England. Okay? So 4 of the first 6 presidents who served the majority of the time as president are going to be from Virginia, heavily populated southern states, heavily populated because they do have a lot of slaves. It raises a question about the 3/5 clause. About the 3/5 clause. Does the 3/5 clause have an impact in more than merely establishing the population of the states, but also begging the question of the fact that these extra representatives acquired through the 3/5 clause gives them more electoral clout when it comes to establishing, picking who the president would be. And so the southern states are going to have a big influence in selecting who goes into the White House. Now, after John Quincy Adams, if we go over into the algebra, after John Quincy Adams is Andrew Jackson, good old AJ from Tennessee. After Andrew Jackson comes from New York, that guy. Oh, he only serves 1 term too, so I've derailed on that guy's name. I've derailed on his name. He's a New Yorker, so I mean, New York. My wife and I were talking about him the other day. He serves as Secretary of State for Andrew Jackson. Van Buren, Martin Van Buren from New York. So the only time another Northerner gets into the White House is because he's a close friend of Andrew Jackson, who helps him to be elevated to the White House. This advantage that the South has because of the 3/5 clause, being able to count 3/5 of their slaves as population, is going to diminish as more immigration, as more people start coming to the country. Because people aren't interested in going to the South, because the South wants to spread out and maintain all of the land that they have, right? Whereas in the North, people are starting to congregate into larger populations. We've got the factory system developing. We've got all of these things happening in the North. So gradually, the population in the South, which is very high at this point, is going to be outstripped by the population in the North. And eventually the North, even with the 3/5 clause in place, the North will wind up having the population superiority in this area. The things we're going to look at now, I'm going to switch to looking at the PowerPoints. We're going to talk about each of these presidents and their primary crises. We'll talk about George Washington and the establishment of the federal government under the first administration. We'll talk about John Adams and his quasi-war with France and the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are a big problem for Adams' administration. We'll talk about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson has a number of problems in his administration, a number of crises, but one of the most important is his Louisiana Purchase. The idea of Louisiana Purchase, more than doubling the size of our country, and then of course the embargo acts with we're having conflict between the French and the British over them seizing our ships. During James Madison's administration, we'll wind up having the War of 1812. During James Monroe's administration, we'll see the decline of the Federalist Party, and he will call it the New Era. We'll get the first time the United States attempts to regulate the institution of slavery, something we call the Missouri Compromise. And then we'll also see Madison have to try to deal with Andrew Jackson, who is a general in the South on the Florida border. Monroe's going to try to handle Jackson, but when Jackson comes back to Washington, Jackson decides he's going to enter politics. Jackson runs against John Quincy Adams, and their vote, the election is very, very close. and it winds up going to the House of Representatives to make the decision. Based on that decision, even though Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote, the Electoral College and all that, Jackson didn't have a clear majority. And so it goes to the House of Representatives between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. The House of Representatives selects John Quincy Adams. In the next election, there are changes to the electoral process, which when John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson run against each other in the next election, Andrew Jackson will win handily. So that's where we're headed. We're going to try this to see how this works, to see if we can get this to work this way, or whether I need to try to use Zoom or something else online. So again, continue reading your texts and taking the quizzes online, and hopefully everybody can stay healthy and safe.